Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The first sign was silence, the type that doesn't just sit in the room, but spreads through it like smoke. It had been days, maybe weeks, since Daniel had truly looked Olivia in the eyes. He still came home, still took off his shoes by the door, still ate the food she cooked. But his presence had begun to feel like a ghost wearing his skin. His laugh, once so full it could ripple across the dinner table like sunlight on water, had become a rare thing, brittle and hollow. Olivia had noticed the changes the way you notice a flower wilting, slowly, then all at once. At first, she thought it was stress, maybe trouble at work, maybe fatigue. But then came the absences, the late nights, the distant, almost mechanical affection toward Clara, their 6-year-old daughter, who still called him daddy, with the same awe as a girl discovering stars. He would touch her head like she was a stranger's child. Olivia had told herself 1,000 small lies just to sleep at night. He's tired, he'll come around, this is just a rough season. But even lies begin to curdle when you say them too often. The final blow came not with thunder, but with the quiet click of a car door and the sharp sound of heels on wet concrete. That afternoon, the sky was stitched with dark clouds, the kind that feel heavy before they even rain. Olivia stood at the kitchen sink, hands submerged in lukewarm water, staring blankly out the window when the unfamiliar red car rolled into the driveway. Daniel stepped out, not in a hurry, not with guilt on his face, but with a blankness that made her stomach knot. And then, the woman stepped out after him. There was nothing accidental about the woman's entrance. She wore a blood-red coat that fit like it had been tailored to tempt. Her lipstick matched. Her chin was tilted in that particular way people do when they know they've won before the game has even begun. She didn't look at Olivia, but Olivia saw her through the curtain and felt a cold hand close around her heart. Daniel opened the front door without knocking. He had his own keys after all, and stood there in the doorway as if the air inside the house no longer belonged to Olivia or Clara. It was no longer their home. It was a house now, just walls and a roof that had betrayed them. Clara was sitting on the floor in the living room, drawing on the back of an old cereal box, humming a tune from the cartoon she watched that morning. Olivia wiped her hands slowly on a dish towel and walked into the room. "Daniel," she asked, her voice thin and trembling despite her efforts. He didn't meet her gaze. "You need to pack your things," he said simply, as if reading from a weather report. "You and Clara. You can't stay here anymore." Olivia froze. "What do you mean?" she said, heart slamming against her ribs like it wanted to escape her body. "What are you saying?" Daniel didn't blink. "I've made my choice." He turned to look toward the open door where the red-coat woman was now leaning casually against the wall, examining her nails. "I need a fresh start. You've had time to see this coming." Olivia wanted to speak, to scream, to throw something, but Clara had risen now, her little doll pressed to her chest, wide brown eyes bouncing between her parents like a bird trapped in a storm. Olivia said nothing. She just bent down, picked Clara up, and carried her to the bedroom, her soul trembling beneath her skin. Packing was like burying someone still alive. Every dress folded felt like a memory suffocating in cloth. The smell of Daniel's cologne still lingered faintly in the bedroom, mocking her with every inhale. She moved on instinct, robotic and numb, until the bag was full and Clara's school shoes were zipped alongside coloring books and an old teddy bear missing one eye. Clara didn't cry. She asked a lot of questions, the kind that stab without meaning to. "Where are we going, Mommy? Did Daddy forget it was my ballet day? Who is that woman in the red coat?" Olivia answered none. Her throat was tight with the pressure of tears she refused to let fall in front of Clara. The last thing she took was the framed photo of their wedding. Tucked behind it was the ultrasound image of Clara when she was no bigger than a plum. She left the wedding photo behind and took only the ultrasound. Outside, the rain had begun. Soft at first, then heavier. Daniel didn't walk them out. The red-coat woman didn't move from her spot. Olivia opened the door and stepped into the rain like someone stepping through fire, holding Clara's hand tightly in hers. The cab she'd called was late. They stood there for 10 minutes, maybe more, soaked to the bone. Clara's backpack sagged with the weight of rainwater, and her pink shoes squeaked each time she shifted from foot to foot. The front door closed behind them with a gentle but final sound. Olivia didn't look back. The rain ran down Olivia's face, mixing with tears she could no longer hide. Clara shivered beside her, small and bewildered, trying to make sense of a world that had flipped upside down before lunchtime. Then came the question, the one that would echo in Olivia's mind for years to come. "Mom," Clara whispered, her voice barely louder than the falling rain, "why does Dad hate us so much?" It wasn't said with anger. It wasn't even a complaint. It was just heartbreak, shaped like a child's voice. Olivia crouched beside her, heart breaking in slow motion. She opened her mouth to answer, but found only silence. Her words were locked behind a dam of grief and shock. She finally said the first thing that came, though it felt like dust in her mouth. "He doesn't hate us, baby. Some people forget how to love the right way." Clara didn't respond. She just looked up at her mother and nodded like a child who had decided to believe something they didn't understand. The cab's headlights cut through the storm. The driver didn't say much, just helped load the bags, watching with the eyes of someone who had seen enough sorrow to stop asking questions. Inside the cab, Clara curled up against her mother. Her fingers found Olivia's again, and she asked one last question before sleep pulled her under. "Are we going home, Mommy?" Olivia looked out into the blurred lights of Elderview, her lips dry, her spirit bent but not yet broken. "No," she whispered, brushing damp hair from Clara's forehead. "But one day we will." The rain kept falling. But something deep in Olivia, something ancient and quiet and made of fire, refused to fall with it. The room they ended up in wasn't much. Just a sagging mattress, a cracked window pane, and a single bulb hanging from a stained ceiling like a tired eyelid refusing to close. The motel stood at the edge of Elderview, tucked between an abandoned auto shop and a diner that never turned off its neon sign. Olivia had found it by asking the cab driver where the cheapest place was. He didn't speak much, but his nod was enough to take them to this forgotten corner of town. When she opened the door and stepped inside with Clara in her arms, the stale scent of mildew greeted them like an unwanted host. The carpet was frayed in patches, the walls bore the scars of careless tenants, and the bathroom faucet wept a constant metallic drip. But to Olivia it was shelter. She laid Clara on the bed, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead, and looked at the ceiling as if waiting for it to collapse or whisper something she needed to hear. The silence, now constant, clung to the room like fog. Olivia sat at the foot of the bed for a long while, still dressed in her rain-wet clothes, staring at the scuffed floorboards with the expression of someone trying to feel the ground beneath them after falling from a great height. Her thoughts had become a tangle of questions that offered no comfort. Where to go next, how to afford food, if Daniel meant what he said, or if there was still some shred of the man she once loved hiding behind that cold stare. She knew deep down she could never return, not because pride held her back, but because something had truly shattered. And once glass breaks, no matter how well you glue it back, the cracks will always show. Morning crept into the room like a thief, not with warmth but with pale, dusty light. Olivia hadn't slept. She had spent the night listening to the soft rhythm of Clara's breathing, counting the space between each inhale like a lullaby made for mothers on the edge. Hunger nudged her awake more than the light did. She ran her fingers through her tangled hair, slipped into yesterday's clothes, and dug into her handbag for the last $20 bill she had folded there weeks ago for emergencies. If this wasn't an emergency, she didn't know what was. The woman at the diner 2 blocks over gave her a once-over when she came in asking about work. Olivia wasn't dressed for a job interview. Her shirt was wrinkled, her shoes muddy, but desperation has a way of speaking louder than fashion. "You ever done dishes?" the woman asked. Olivia nodded, though the truth was she hadn't, not professionally. She had cleaned her own kitchen 1,000 times, wiped spaghetti sauce off walls, pulled dried cereal from corners, scrubbed the scent of burnt toast out of the toaster, but this was different. This wasn't survival out of routine. This was survival out of necessity. She was told to come back that evening, and when she did, the job was hers. Minimum wage. No questions asked. Olivia walked back to the motel with a bag of fries and a small chocolate milk for Clara. The little girl sat cross-legged on the bed, her doll tucked under one arm, and her coloring books spread out like sacred scriptures. She took the food without asking where it came from or why her mother looked so tired. Children, especially the quiet ones, know better than most when not to ask questions they already feel the answers to. Olivia sat beside her and took a long, slow sip of tap water, trying to convince herself it was enough. Days folded into each other like pages from an old book no one wanted to read. Olivia worked the night shift at the diner, returning before dawn, often with blistered palms and aching legs. She would tiptoe into the room and find Clara asleep, her small body curled like a comma in a story that had paused mid-sentence. Mrs. Haggerty, the elderly woman in the next room, had offered to watch Clara during Olivia's shifts. She didn't ask for money, just someone to talk to when her bones hurt too much for sleep. She reminded Olivia of her grandmother, always wearing socks that didn't match and speaking to the television as if it were an old friend. Clara had taken to her quickly, especially when she offered her sugar cubes as treats and told her stories about her late cat, Buttons, who could apparently open doors. Olivia was grateful, though a piece of her ached every time she left Clara behind, knowing her daughter deserved more than chipped cups, thin walls, and second-hand lullabies. In between shifts and exhaustion, Olivia began jotting words into a small notebook she kept hidden in her purse. Not poetry or prayers, just pieces of her unraveling. Thoughts she couldn't say aloud, written in pen with trembling hands. He looked through me. She didn't blink when she stood beside him. My daughter thinks love is something that disappears. These weren't meant for anyone else. They were her way of keeping herself from vanishing. She wrote in the bathroom stall, on her lunch break, between wiping counters and scraping burnt eggs off greasy plates. The act of writing was the only thing that didn't feel like survival. It felt like proof she still existed. It wasn't until the third week that Olivia received the letter. Folded and slipped under the motel door in a plain envelope, it bore Daniel's name in the corner, typed in ink too clean for such dirty news. The letter was brief, no apologies, no pleasantries. Just lines filled with cold legal jargon. Daniel had filed for full custody of Clara. He stated that Olivia was unfit, unstable, without proper housing or employment. He had the audacity to include a sentence about how he was acting in Clara's best interest, as though throwing his daughter into the street with her mother wasn't a memory she would carry like a stone in her chest. Olivia read the letter 3 times. The first time with disbelief, the second with fury, the third with a calm so deep it frightened her. There was no more room in her for grief. Anger had taken its seat and made itself comfortable. She folded the paper neatly and slid it back into the envelope. Clara was napping on the bed, one hand still gripping the ear of her teddy bear. Olivia looked at her daughter's sleeping face and made a promise, not out loud, but in the quiet way that only mothers do. She would fight, not because she believed the system would care, not because she hoped Daniel would change, but because Clara deserved someone who wouldn't walk away. And no matter how tired she was, how alone she felt, how small her world had become, she would not let that man take what little they had left. She picked up her pen that night, not to write grief, but war. The kind fought with paperwork and persistence. The kind won with patience and pain. When Olivia first started writing the letters, they weren't meant for Daniel. They weren't even meant to be seen. They began as quiet conversations she couldn't bring herself to say aloud. Half confessions, half questions, like throwing stones into a bottomless lake just to hear the splash. She wrote in the silence of the motel bathroom, perched on the closed lid of the toilet while Clara napped, the motel's overhead fan humming its sad lullaby. There was something raw and grounding in putting her thoughts to paper, something that gave her pain shape and weight. It was easier to whisper to the page than to face her own reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. The letters were not full of rage. They were slow, aching things, soaked with confusion, and the kind of love that doesn't know where to go once it's been turned away. She started the first one with Daniel's name, even though she didn't know if she still meant it when she wrote it. "Daniel," it began. "Today Clara asked me if all daddies leave when they find someone prettier. I told her no. I don't know if that makes me a liar or just a mother trying not to break her child's heart." That was how the letters went, small windows into moments she wished she didn't have to survive. She didn't mail them. She kept them folded neatly inside the notebook she now carried everywhere, tucked between her apron strings at work or pressed to her chest when she slept. The act of writing didn't change the past, but it softened the edges of it. She found herself revisiting memories of better times not to relive them, but to understand where the cracks had begun. And somewhere in those pages, she began to see that the truth of what happened wasn't just about betrayal. It was about loss, and how quietly it settles in when you're not looking. The memory that kept returning was one she had long buried. A late evening 5 years ago, after Clara had turned 1. It was winter, the heater had broken, and Olivia had wrapped their daughter in 3 blankets while Daniel tried to light a fire in the old living room hearth. There had been laughter that night, warm and full, and Daniel's hands had trembled slightly as he tucked Clara into the cradle they'd built together from scrap wood. That version of him, the one who kissed her on the forehead and whispered, "We're gonna be all right," was the ghost she mourned. What happened to that man? She had turned the question over and over in her mind like a stone in her pocket, hoping the edges would wear down. Maybe it was fatherhood that had overwhelmed him, or the pressure of expectations, or perhaps the monster was always there, just hidden under layers of charm. Whatever the answer, it didn't change the present. Still, Olivia couldn't help but feel responsible. Women often do, even when the evidence points elsewhere. She had loved Daniel with a kind of reverence, the way a tree loves sunlight, without questioning if the light will last. Now, in the aftermath, she sat alone in a room that smelled of cheap detergent and old smoke, with her daughter asleep beside her and her world reduced to a notebook and a drawer of folded uniforms. Clara had started asking different questions now, less direct but more haunting. Do mommies ever stop missing people? If you love someone, and they stop loving you, does your love go bad like milk? Olivia did her best to answer, but more often than not, she just held her tighter and let the silence fill the gaps. Children always feel what words fail to explain. One particularly cold night, the motel lost power. It was as if the universe had grown tired of watching Olivia hold herself together and decided to shake the walls a little harder. The room turned to shadows, and Clara whimpered at the sudden darkness, her small hands reaching for her mother's. Olivia lit a candle Mrs. Haggerty had given her, just in case, and placed it on the windowsill. Its light flickered across their faces like a warning and a promise. They sat wrapped in a blanket, and Olivia told Clara stories, not the ones from books, but the ones from memory. She spoke about when Clara was born, how she had arrived 3 weeks early during a thunderstorm, how Daniel had cried when he held her, even though he later denied it. Olivia didn't lie about what came after. She didn't paint him as a hero or a monster. She told it as it happened, the slow shifts, the shrinking affection, the way a house can stay clean even as the love inside it rots. Clara listened quietly, her eyes wide in the candlelight. When the story ended, she asked if they'd ever go back to that house. Olivia looked at her, studied the softness of her cheeks, and said, "We don't belong in places that try to erase us." It was the first time she had spoken that truth aloud, and once she did, it settled inside her like a key turning in a long rusted lock. That night, with only one candle to light their grief, something began to shift. Olivia realized she had been surviving for Clara, but now she had to start living for her too. That meant confronting what she had avoided, not just the pain Daniel caused, but the silence she had kept out of fear, the wounds she had learned to clean quietly instead of scream about. She was done bleeding in private. A week after the power outage, Clara found one of the letters. Olivia had stepped out to collect instant noodles from the motel's vending machine, and the notebook must have slipped out of her bag. When she returned, Clara was sitting cross-legged on the bed, the pages unfolded like treasure maps in her lap. She didn't look up right away. Olivia froze in the doorway, heart pounding, unsure whether to snatch the pages back or let them be. Before she could speak, Clara looked up and said, "You write like you're telling secrets to the sky." Olivia sat down beside her, unsure how much Clara had understood or whether that even mattered. "Why do you write about him?" Clara asked, and Olivia struggled to find the right words. "Because if I don't, I forget how much we lived through, and I don't want to forget, even the bad parts." Clara nodded, as if that answer settled something deep inside her. She handed back the pages carefully, as though they were fragile things, and then leaned against her mother's side. Olivia wrapped an arm around her, and let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. That night, long after Clara had fallen asleep, Olivia read through the letters one more time. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She just read them as if she were witnessing someone else's life, and for the first time, she began to feel distance from the pain. She pulled out a clean sheet of paper and began a new letter. Not to Daniel, but to herself. She didn't know what it would say yet. All she knew was that her story wasn't over, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid to write the next part. It began with the coat. Red to red. Olivia had never liked that color, not because it reminded her of rage, but because it demanded to be seen. Marina wore it the same way someone wears entitlement, boldly, unapologetically, like she was daring the world to accuse her of anything. That morning, Olivia had walked Clara to school beneath a sky that had yet to decide if it would rain or shine. She'd taken the long route to avoid the stretch of road that passed Daniel's neighborhood, but fate had a cruel way of looping people back into their hurt. Outside a small pharmacy, across from a faded newspaper kiosk, stood Marina. She was arguing with someone over the phone, her face twisted in a way Olivia had never seen before. Not composed, not smug, but desperate. Olivia's breath caught. She hadn't meant to stop, but her feet froze as if summoned by something more ancient than curiosity. From a distance, Marina's words were muffled, but her body language screamed. Olivia stood by a lamppost, half hidden by a rusted bus stop sign, eyes narrowed. The woman wasn't playing the part of a proud new wife anymore. She looked like someone running out of moves in a game she thought she was winning. Olivia didn't approach. She didn't speak. But something stirred beneath her ribs, an instinct sharpened by months of being left to rot in silence. When Marina stormed off into a waiting car, not Daniel's, a thought slid through Olivia's mind like a cold blade. Not everything was what it seemed. That night, long after Clara had fallen asleep with her knees curled to her chest, Olivia sat at the small desk beneath the motel's dusty window and wrote down everything she remembered. The name of the pharmacy, the man in the car, the urgency in Marina's voice. There was no plan yet, only a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, purpose. The following days unraveled slowly. Olivia returned to the diner every evening, her apron damp with soap water, her hands raw from scrubbing dishes. But her mind was elsewhere. When the waitress in the back room offered her half a sandwich from her lunch, Olivia barely tasted it. She had begun observing patterns, Daniel's routines, the time Clara said he used to pick her up from school before everything changed, the places he never took her but always mentioned in passing. In the quiet lull between diner rushes, she asked questions. Nothing obvious, just the kind that linger like harmless dust. Ever seen a red car waiting outside the pharmacy on Tuesdays? Does that tall woman in the coat ever come in here? Most people shrugged her off. Some gave her half answers. But all it took was one voice, one tiny truth, to start unraveling a thread. An older man who cleaned floors at the back of the pharmacy mentioned seeing Marina often. "But she don't look sick to me," he said. "Always comes in, buys gum, makes a call outside, then leaves. Same time. Every week." Olivia nodded, thanked him, and carried the knowledge like a stone in her pocket. The thing about pain is that when it lingers long enough, it begins to see patterns others overlook. She noticed the way Marina kept her phone in her left hand, the way she lit cigarettes but never smoked them, and how the man in the sleek black car was never the same. Sometimes older, sometimes young, sometimes no man at all, but a woman with a briefcase. It didn't add up to infidelity. It reeked of something else, something that couldn't be explained with just heartbreak. Olivia went back to the city clerk's office, where an old college friend named Leonard now worked in records. Their friendship had faded over time, but desperation has a way of resurrecting forgotten alliances. "I just need you to look up a name," she said. Leonard hesitated but agreed. What they found made Olivia's blood go cold. Marina, real name Marissa Kane, had multiple addresses listed across 3 counties. Her employment history was paper-thin, littered with shell companies and legal entities that didn't even have working phone numbers. She wasn't a spouse. She wasn't a girlfriend. She was something else entirely, a handler, perhaps, or worse, a funnel. Olivia had no idea what Daniel had gotten himself into, but it reeked of laundering or fraud. There were court records buried in old files, not under Daniel's name, but connected by address, property transfers, and accounts that bore a signature too similar to his to be coincidental. She didn't confront him immediately. She knew better now. Instead, she printed what she could, took photographs of screens when she couldn't afford the printouts, and kept it all in a manila folder hidden in Clara's old baby blanket at the bottom of her suitcase. That night, when she returned to the motel, Clara was asleep on Mrs. Haggerty's lap, and the old woman smiled gently as Olivia entered. "She asked if you were fighting dragons again," she said with a wink. Olivia forced a tired smile, kissed her daughter's forehead, and whispered, "Not dragons, just snakes." The motel room felt smaller than ever. The walls seemed to lean in on her, as if pressing her to act. She sat down on the edge of the bed and flipped through the documents again. There, in between old court filings and bank transfer statements, she saw a detail she had missed earlier. One of the shell accounts was opened in Clara's name. Olivia's chest tightened. This wasn't just betrayal. This was exposure. Her daughter had unknowingly become part of whatever this was, and suddenly the fight wasn't just about custody or heartbreak. It was about protection. About justice. About reclaiming the narrative before Daniel could twist it even further. Olivia didn't sleep that night. Her mind raced in loops, drawing invisible lines between every strange interaction, every distant look Daniel had given her in those final weeks before he pushed her out the door. It had never been about love. Not entirely. It had been about risk management. She had seen too much, asked too many questions, and in Daniel's world, that made her a liability. He hadn't just replaced her with Marina, he'd buried her existence to keep his secrets safe. And Clara? She wasn't just collateral. She was leverage. That realization struck Olivia like lightning in the chest. She had underestimated the depth of his manipulation. But the time for sorrow had passed. Now was the time for action. She began drafting a letter, not to Daniel, but to his attorney. Not emotional. Not pleading. Factual. Structured. Attached were copies of the documents she'd gathered. She didn't threaten. She hinted. A whisper of a storm waiting to be unleashed if he dared push further. She had no legal team, no money for court fees, but she had evidence and persistence, two weapons far more dangerous than Daniel imagined. She finished the letter just as dawn began to bleed into the sky. The light was dim, but steady. Clara stirred under the covers, murmuring something about pancakes in her sleep. Olivia watched her for a moment, then whispered to herself, "We're not losing again." She sealed the envelope, tucked it into her bag, and stood tall for the first time in weeks. The fight had begun. And this time, she wasn't the one on the run. It was on a Wednesday, when the sky looked bruised and the wind smelled faintly of rust, that Olivia decided to go back to the law office that had sent the original custody letter. She didn't expect to be welcomed, she wasn't. The receptionist gave her a smile sharp enough to draw blood and told her, in a tone dipped in polite disdain, that her presence wasn't necessary unless her own lawyer reached out. Olivia didn't flinch. She had no lawyer. No funds. But she had something better, proof. She didn't demand a meeting. She simply placed a new envelope on the counter and said, "If your client doesn't back off, everything in this folder goes to the District Financial Crimes Unit." The receptionist blinked. She didn't smile this time. Olivia turned and left before another word could be said. As she stepped into the elevator, her reflection caught her eye in the polished metal of the doors. She looked older, sharper. Her jaw was tight, her eyes unreadable. For the first time, she didn't see the woman who had once begged a man to explain why he stopped loving her. She saw someone who had learned to walk through fire without asking for water. That evening, after returning to the motel, she opened her notebook and wrote nothing. Not a single line. Instead, she sat by the window, watching Clara sort buttons into neat little piles on the floor. Olivia was beginning to realize that some parts of healing don't require words. They only need stillness. Mrs. Haggerty stopped by with a warm tin of cornbread, muttering something about how storms were good for thinking, but bad for sleeping. Olivia thanked her, offered her tea, and they sat for a while in the hush of mutual understanding. The rain came later, tapping on the window like someone too polite to intrude. Olivia didn't move from the chair. She let it fall. The next morning, a white envelope slid under their motel door. No stamp. No handwriting. Just her name, Olivia Matthews, typed in bold letters across the front. Her stomach turned. She stared at it for several seconds before reaching down and opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, one sentence in plain black text. "Let it go, Olivia. You're going to regret this." No signature. No address. Just that. She read it again, slower this time, as if expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something less hollow. But they didn't. She folded the paper and placed it on the nightstand, her hands steady. Clara was brushing her doll's hair, humming softly to herself. Olivia kissed the top of her daughter's head and said nothing. Fear, once allowed to grow roots, can become a permanent tenant in the mind. But something in Olivia had changed. The woman who used to flinch at every closed door and every unfamiliar voice had been replaced by someone who didn't believe in warnings from cowards. She walked to the nearest corner store and asked the clerk if their security cameras had caught anything unusual. He checked. A man in a gray coat had entered the building at dawn, face hidden by a baseball cap, posture stiff with caution. Olivia didn't recognize him. But that didn't matter. She wasn't looking for identity anymore. She was collecting patterns. She made a copy of the footage on her phone and sent it to Leonard, who had reluctantly agreed to help her dig further. "This is deeper than I thought," he texted an hour later. "You need to be careful, Liv." She stared at the message and typed back slowly. "Being careful is what got me here. It's time I stopped being careful." She deleted the text and never hit send. That night, Olivia dreamed of drowning. Not in water, but in sound. People speaking around her, through her, over her, but never to her. She tried to scream, but no voice came. She awoke with her hands clenched into fists and her chest heaving. Clara was fast asleep, her small hand resting on Olivia's forearm. The storm had passed, leaving a strange hush behind. Olivia lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of the dream melt into her bones. She understood now. This was no longer about her pain. This was about protecting her daughter from a legacy of silence, from being used, from being erased. She couldn't rewrite what Daniel had done, but she could stop him from continuing it. The next morning, she contacted a non-profit legal aid clinic downtown. She brought copies of the documents, arranged chronologically, including the bank records with Clara's name and the unsigned threat letter. The attorney, a young woman with eyes too tired for her age, took one look at the files and called in a supervisor. By the end of the meeting, Olivia had filed for a protective motion and initiated her own counterclaim for custody. She walked out of that office with shaking knees but a spine of steel. In the weeks that followed, she began preparing Clara for the day they would testify. Not with fear, but with gentle honesty. She didn't tell her everything, only what a child needed to feel safe. When someone tries to take something that belongs to you, she told Clara one evening while combing her hair, you don't run. You stand still and remind them why they can't. Clara nodded, her eyes wide, her voice soft. Like you did, Mommy? Olivia smiled. Exactly like that. The hearing was held in a building that smelled of paper, worry, and cold air. Olivia arrived early, her fingers wrapped tightly around Clara's hand, the documents she had gathered pressed neatly inside a weathered file folder that felt heavier than it should. The courtroom was smaller than she expected, no soaring ceilings or polished wood panels like in the movies. Just pale walls, uncomfortable chairs, and a judge who looked like she'd seen too many lies to believe anything easily. Daniel sat across the room in a gray suit that probably still carried the price tag tucked under the sleeve. He didn't look at Olivia, not even once. His lawyer whispered to him occasionally, eyes flicking toward the judge, toward Olivia, toward Clara. Marina, or Marissa, was nowhere in sight. Olivia had expected as much. People like her knew when to vanish. Clara sat quietly beside her mother, legs swinging above the floor, clutching her doll to her chest. She'd been prepared gently over several nights, with words softened to match her age. She knew her voice would matter. And it did. When asked simple questions, she answered with the calmness of a child who had learned to trust truth more than comfort. When the judge asked her who she wanted to stay with, she said, Mommy, because she doesn't leave when things are scary. Olivia's throat burned, but she didn't cry. She kept her gaze steady, her hands still, and waited for the moment she could breathe again. When her turn came, she stood without notes. No speech, no script, just her voice in the file. She handed over the documents, spoke clearly, and laid out the facts. The fraudulent accounts, the misuse of Clara's identity, the threat letter. The judge didn't react right away. She listened, read, and then turned to Daniel. For the first time in a long while, Olivia saw something flicker in his expression, panic, not rage. When the session ended, there was no celebration. Just a decision. Temporary full custody to Olivia, investigation pending. It wasn't the end, but it was a door opening. The ride home was quiet. Clara fell asleep in the back seat of the cab, her head against the window, mouth slightly open, one hand still wrapped around her doll's cloth arm. Olivia stared out at the streets as they passed. Places that once felt too big now seemed small and faded. The motel came into view, its chipped paint and leaning sign welcoming them like an old, stubborn friend. The clerk nodded as they passed, wordlessly handing over a new key card. Olivia had extended their stay until she could figure out a permanent home, but something inside her knew they wouldn't be here much longer. The ground beneath her no longer felt borrowed. Upstairs, she tucked Clara in with the tenderness of someone who had nearly lost everything. As the little girl stirred and mumbled something incoherent in sleep, Olivia kissed her forehead and pulled the blanket up to her chin. She sat in the plastic chair by the window, same as before, only this time she wasn't watching for threats. She was watching the horizon. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Leonard. He's scared. I heard they've frozen 2 of his accounts. I think you just bought your way out. Olivia didn't reply. She didn't need to. The quiet in her chest said enough. She stared at the parking lot lights reflecting in the puddles below, remembering the night Clara had asked if daddies stopped loving their children when they found someone prettier. That memory no longer cut her open, it had scabbed. It had healed. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it slowly. Mrs. Haggerty stood there with a bag of leftover soup and a box of chocolate crackers. "You look different," the old woman said, eyeing her closely. Olivia smiled. "I feel different." They sat for a while in the yellow lamplight, soup steaming between them, two women who had survived different storms and found shelter in each other's company. Weeks passed. Papers arrived in the mail, official documents, updates from the court, notices about accounts under review. Olivia kept them organized in a clean folder that she now stored in a lockbox beside her bed. The motel room began to change. Clara's drawings lined the wall above the bed, taped gently in a collage of color and crooked letters. Olivia found work at a bookstore 2 blocks away from the diner. Fewer hours, more stability. She liked the smell of the pages and the quiet hum of customers browsing stories they hadn't lived. The manager, a soft-spoken man with hands stained by old ink, offered her extra hours without her asking. She accepted. Every evening, she and Clara walked home together, their hands joined, their shadows long in the amber light of early dusk. They began a new routine: Tuesday puzzles, Thursday pancake dinners, Sunday library trips. The world hadn't righted itself overnight, but it no longer leaned as heavily on her shoulders. Clara started to hum again while brushing her doll's hair, and Olivia caught her laughing, genuinely laughing, at a cartoon one morning. Those sounds filled the air like birdsong in spring after a long winter. Olivia bought a second-hand camera with her first full paycheck and began photographing the little things. Clara's hands covered in paint, the worn notebook resting on the windowsill, the smile lines on Mrs. Haggerty's cheeks. She didn't post them anywhere. She just printed them and placed them in a shoebox marked proof of life. Every time she added a new photo, she whispered to herself, "We're still here." The phrase became a quiet ritual, a reminder that survival wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning. Eventually, a new opportunity presented itself. A tenant had moved out of a small one-bedroom unit 3 streets over, a former storage space above a florist's shop. The rent was modest. The ceiling slanted. The windows stuck sometimes, but it had a little porch that caught the morning sun and enough space for Clara to have a desk of her own. Olivia took it. On move-in day, Clara helped carry boxes, her excitement barely contained, pointing out where the doll's bed would go and how she wanted to hang fairy lights above the window. Olivia didn't correct her dreams. She encouraged them. They set up their home slowly, deliberately. No rush. Each plate placed on the shelf felt like a declaration. This is ours now. No one can take it. On their first night, Olivia made pasta with cheap sauce and powdered cheese. They ate sitting on the floor, plates balanced on their knees, laughter rising in small bursts between mouthfuls. After dinner, Clara sat on the porch and looked up at the sky, her legs dangling off the step. Olivia joined her, wrapping a blanket around their shoulders. Clara turned and said, "I don't miss him anymore." Olivia looked at her, saw no bitterness, just clarity. "Me neither," she said softly. And for the first time in what felt like 100 years, she meant it. They sat there long after the stars appeared, not speaking, not needing to. Just breathing. Just being. A mother and daughter, once broken by betrayal, now mended by truth. Olivia closed her eyes and whispered something she hadn't dared to speak until that night. Thank you. Not to Daniel. Not to fate. But to herself. For holding on. For refusing to vanish. For becoming more than what was done to her. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones we once trusted the deepest. But remember this, being broken is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of becoming whole again, on your own terms. Never let someone else's decision define your worth. Healing takes time, but peace comes when you choose to protect your soul over their approval. Hold your head high, even with a scarred heart. You survived for a reason. May your heart never forget how to hope, even after it's been hurt. May every tear you cried water the seeds of something better. May you find rest in the middle of the storm and strength where you once felt weak. May no betrayal steal your light, and may your peace speak louder than your pain. May you walk into rooms where love feels safe and real again. May your children grow in homes full of warmth, not silence. May your voice be heard, your truth be honored, and your future be free from fear. And when you rise from the ashes, may you rise with grace, power, and purpose. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.